wanted to introduce our guest today for our discussion of Professor Bernhardi, a play by Arthur Schnitzler. I hope people enjoyed reading the play, by the way. I thought it would be interesting to choose a play. We've really only read one other play in the group, and that was Nathan the Wise. Sophie actually had to remind me. Anyway, I'd like to introduce our guest today, who has done a lot of work with Professor Bernhardi, and I'm honored that she accepted to be with us today. Dr. Judith Beniston. She's an associate professor at the University College of London, England. She has published a study of the revival of Catholic drama that accompanied the rise of political Catholicism in Austria in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and has written articles on numerous aspects of Austria's theater culture, especially during the First Austrian Republic. From 2003 to 2010, she co-edited the annual journal Austrian Studies with Robert Vilain and has guest edited the 2013 issue, Cultures at War, Austria-Hungary, 1914 to 1918, with Deborah Holmes, and the 2019 issue, Placing Schnitzler, with Andrew Weber. She was co-investigator from 2014 to 2020 of the project Digital Critical Edition of the Middle Period Works by Arthur Schnitzler, 1862 to 1931. And within this project is lead editor of the medical drama, Professor Bernhardi, which we have read. Dr. Beniston has worked intensively on the play for a few years now and is in the final stages of preparing the digital critical edition. So Judith, I'll let you take over at this point, and welcome, and we're pleased to have you.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll if I may just, your screen sharing, I'll now start the slideshow. It seems to have sort of stopped itself. Hopefully I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I shall sort of stop myself if I ramble on much longer.
You can keep going if it's interesting, you know, Judith, that's okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm aware that today is Holocaust Memorial Day, or that's the label for it that's usually used in the UK. And in choosing to discuss Arthur Schnitzler's Professor Bernhardi on particularly this day, we're focusing on a play that's centrally concerned with anti-Semitism in turn of the century Vienna, and also a play where post-war stagings and audience responses have been coloured, if not haunted, by our collective knowledge of where that anti-Semitism ultimately led. And that sort of post-Holocaust awareness is something that particularly impacts on the play's genre, calling into question, I think, Schnitzler's designation of Professor Bernhardi as a comedy. And here on the title page of the first edition, you can see Professor Bernhardi, Komödie von Arthur Schnitzler. I want to talk about the play under 4 headings. So I want to say a little bit about the play today, its contemporary recent reception, a little bit about some biographical context. I want to talk about the first production and all the political problems that surrounded that. And then I want to just throw out a few thoughts and ideas, so something that will hopefully spark discussion. In the German-speaking world, Bernhardi has been produced numerous times since the 1950s, in the theatre and also on TV. There have been quite a few, 4 or 5 different TV drama versions of it. Not least because as an effort was made to ensure that the Jewish contribution wasn't written out of German cultural history. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, though, interest has been particularly strong in the last 10 years, 10 dozen years. There was a production at the Burgtheater in 2011, and then 2 major productions in 2016, one at the Theater in der Josefstadt in Vienna, and the other one which was directed by Thomas Ostermeyer at the Schaubühne in Berlin. Ostermeyer, as I'm sure some of you are aware, has a reputation for rebooting canonical texts. So there was a lot of interest in this production, and it's from this production that I've taken the image. Both of these were, I think, prompted or accompanied by a perception that the resurgence of right-wing popularism in Europe at the time heightened the contemporary relevance of Professor Bernhardi, insofar as the anti-Semitism in the play could be seen to exemplify the problem of racism more broadly. 3 years later, then, in 2019, there followed two free adaptations. Olga Hellenbach's Dr. Alici, in which the main figure is a Muslim woman rather than a Jewish man, and Schnitzler's conflict between ethics and politics is relocated to contemporary Munich. And also in English, Robert Icke's The Doctor. That play describes itself as being very freely adapted from Arthur Schnitzler's Professor Bernhardi, but it actually retains a good many of Schnitzler's core concerns, including that with anti-Semitism. The title figure is female, but still Jewish. The Doctor, which won several British Theatre Awards just before COVID hit, has been translated into German as Die Ärztin, and it actually had its premiere at the Burgtheater in Vienna about 3 weeks ago. So it's still very much around, and if it comes to New York, I recommend it. Alongside these theatrical events, a lot of editorial work on Schnitzler's been going on in Germany, Austria, and the UK. And if I'm allowed to do 2 minutes of sort of self-advertising, I've been working, as Michael said, on the digital critical edition of Professor Bernhardi, which will be available online as part of a digital edition that's hosted by Cambridge University Library. This is the front page to it, and the edition is already there on Cambridge University Library's website. I've also been working together with various partners to try and raise Schnitzler's public profile in the UK. And that included working on an evening of staged readings that was part of London's Jewish Book Week last year, and also producing an abridged translation of Professor Bernhardi, which has been staged by the Foreign Affairs Theatre Company in various academic and medical settings, including, as in this image, in the Pathology Museum of Bart's Hospital in London. Okay, if I move on to biography, Professor Bernhardi was written largely between 1905 and 1912, and it had its premiere on the 28th of November, 1912. As you can see from his dates, Schnitzler turned 50 in 1912. So Professor Bernhardi very much belongs to the sort of mid-period of his career. And that's the period when he was most productive and most successful. There are 2 biographical points that are particularly important for Professor Bernhardi, one of them perhaps slightly more obvious than the other. First, that he was an Austrian Jewish writer from an affluent, assimilated family. He lived in Vienna all his life, was born there, died there, and is buried there in the Jewish section of the Central Cemetery. His son Heinrich and his ex-wife Olga both went into exile in 1938, as did Schnitzler's archive, which is now largely in Cambridge University Library. And if anybody would like to know how it ended up in Cambridge, it's a story I will happily tell. Throughout Schnitzler's career, he was the target of vicious anti-Semitic attacks in the nationalist and right-wing press. But only twice did he ever really write centrally about questions of race and anti-Semitism. First in the novel Der Weg ins Freie, The Road into the Open, which appeared in 1908, and then 4 years later in Professor Bernhardi. The Schnitzlers were not just a Jewish family, they were also, importantly, a medical family. Arthur's maternal grandfather had been a doctor, His father, Johann Schnitzler, who's pictured here, was a prominent laryngologist, so throat specialist. His younger brother, Julius, became a well-respected surgeon, and his sister Gisela married Marcus Hayek, who, amongst other distinctions, was Sigmund Freud's doctor. Arthur Schnitzler followed the family tradition. He qualified in 1885 and worked his way up to become his father's assistant at the Wiener Allgemeine Poliklinik. The Poliklinik was a charitably funded hospital that his father had helped to found together with a group of Jewish colleagues in 1872. That hospital is the model for the Elisabethinum in Bernhardi, and Schnitzler draws both on his father's experience in founding and later running the Poliklinik, and also on his own memories of studying and then of working in the Poliklinik, and indeed also in the Allgemeines Krankenhaus in Vienna. Although medicine dominated Schnitzler's life until he was in his 30s, he was never really very committed to it. And he resigned from the Poliklinik pretty much as soon as his father died in 1893. He'd started writing and publishing aphorisms, poems, short prose texts, and then plays from the late 1880s on. But his real breakthrough came in 1895, when the play LBI, which Tom Stoppard translated as Dalliance and David Harrower as Sweet Nothings, was staged at the Burgtheater in Vienna, and this is the poster from the first production. Schnitzler made his name as an Austrian exponent of realism. One might think of him as a sort of Viennese Ibsen, and indeed Professor Bernhardi has quite a lot in common with Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, which is also has a Dr. Stockmann as the central character. Most of Schnitzler's plays, and indeed his stories, depict contemporary Austrian society. His work was perceived at the time as being modern in its emphasis on psychology, and also socially progressive in its critique of things like the military code of honor and sexual double standards. But Professor Bernhardi was a new departure for him. The starting point for previous plays had always been private or domestic conflicts, often erotic entanglements that cut across social classes. Professor Bernhardi is a play with no romantic interest, no love interest, almost no female characters, and it's centrally concerned not with private issues, but with the functioning of institutions, religious, political, legal, and medical. Okay, that point on institutions takes me on to the question, what I think of as the Bernhardi affair, and the press referred to it very much as the Bernhardi affair. The play was the subject of protracted dispute. Schnitzler wanted the first production to take place in Vienna. But when the Volkstheater submitted the text to the censor in October 1912, as they were obliged by law to do, permission was refused. It was relatively common for the censor to demand cuts and revisions to a play, but very rare for plays to be banned outright, least of all ones by well-known Austrian writers. The case was extensively reported in the Viennese press, and as in the play, questions were asked in Parliament. It was initially assumed that Catholic sensibilities had been offended by Bernhardi refusing the priest access to the dying woman. That was a plausible assumption, because in the years leading up to the First World War, Viennese anti-Semitism was becoming more and more pronounced. And relations between conservative Catholics on the right and liberal and social groupings on the left were very strained, both in Parliament and in broader civil society. Notwithstanding this, it actually emerged somewhat later that the main reason for the performance ban was not the religious issue, but Schnitzler's unflattering depiction of Austrian public life, of that prevailing climate of prejudice and political opportunism. After a failed appeal against the ban, the premiere of Professor Bernhardi took place not in Vienna, but at the Kleines Theater in Berlin, under the direction of Victor Barnowski. And as I said earlier, it took place on the 28th of November, 1912. The play ran for several months and was then taken up in several other German cities, and also was translated and performed within 2 or 3 years in various other countries which readily received translated drama. So it was performed, for example, in Denmark, in Russia, in Sweden, and in some of the sort of Budapest and Prague. It was also, interestingly, in January 1914, performed at the Irving Place Theatre in New York. So this was I think, the first US production of it, but in German. The Austrian performance ban, although it had in a sense been widely seen and indeed widely read, the Austrian performance ban was upheld by the authorities right through until the collapse of the empire in 1918. The director of the Volkstheater started planning a production pretty much as soon as that looked likely. And on the 31st of October 1918, Schnitzler wrote this in his diary. I'll read the English translation. Director Bernau rang. Since censorship has effectively been abolished, he wants to stage Bernhardi as soon as possible. Gratifying, but rather costly. It's taken World War and revolution to make this production possible in Vienna. That Viennese premiere duly took place on the 21st of December 1918. Schnitzler had reread the play earlier in the year, again because theatres were already making inquiries about it, and he noted this in his diary. There are things of mine that I like better, but nowhere do I like myself better than in Bernhardi. I think this comment can be and has been used as the basis of a rather narrow biographical reading, but it also registers an awareness that he'd taken risks with this play, and also that he was proud of having addressed some important and difficult issues. And the two images here, as you'll see, are from the one on the left is from the 1912 Berlin production, and the one on the right is from the first British production of the play, which was in 1936 and was actually directed by Schnitzler's son, Heinrich. Okay, moving on to my just final comments and just some thoughts which will hopefully stimulate discussion. Professor Bernhardi is an analytical drama. The only real action comes at the end of Act 1, and then the rest of the play explores the ramifications of that moment of conflict between doctor and priest. So in that sense, it has that same sort of structure as an Ibsen play. It raises questions, first about the relationship between medicine and religion. Does Bernhardi act purely as a doctor, as he claims, or inevitably as a Jewish doctor? Does medicine bring with it a humanistic ethical code that overrides religious or political affiliations? That's one question that I think the play asks. Another one is paternalism, an issue here. We've got a male doctor and a male priest arguing about how a female patient ought to die, and indeed about whether she has any right to know that she's dying. Many of the early Reviews of Professor Bernhardi described the play as politically tendentious and either applauded or deplored that. The term that was used in German is Tendenzstück. Schnitzler, according to these commentators, was making a case for secularism and showing the damage that anti-Semitism and a re-Catholicization agenda were doing to public life and public institutions. Is that really the focus of the play, do we think? Is that what it says to us now? Schnitzler responded to these sort of commentaries in letters and in several unpublished texts by insisting that the play was not politically tendentious. What he repeatedly called it was a Charakterkomödie, a comedy of character. And that raises, I think, another couple of issues. First, how far do we today perceive the play as a comedy? Did you laugh while you were reading it? And if so, why? Did you laugh at characters? Did you laugh with them? In what ways is it still comic? And second, how do we view the title figure? Do we admire his personal integrity, the fact that he has principles and sticks to them when so many others don't? Or does his stubbornness and his refusal to engage with politics make him, as Flint argues, a ridiculous or even a tragicomic figure? And I think those are all sort of questions that I would like to just sort of throw out and that we can potentially address.